This video is for educational purposes only. None of the information or the topics discussed in this video constitute medical advice. First of all, bro, I wanted to know, like, when did you discover Kratom? Like, why did you find it? How did you find it? And yeah, like, what was your experience with that?
I think when it came to discovering Kratom, I had heard about it in the past from a girl I had dated maybe like 8 or so years ago, and she was explaining her experience with it, but I had never really looked too much into it. And then I had some experience with doing like brokering deals with rare cannabinoids in Japan, and from there, I mean, Thailand is obviously close to Japan. It's in like Southeast Asia. Japan's a little bit more in the north eastern sector, but from there, I had spoken to one of my business partners at the time, and he had said that he was very interested in 70H and the prospects surrounding it. So from there, I had actually had previous business meetings with a guy from Chicago that didn't really pan into anything. So he had given me a call at one point asking me if he could get me to supply him with 80 kilos of kratom, because we were doing like large scale importation of like THCP, THCPO, THCJD, and things of that nature that were legal at the time in Japan. Now, since then, the legislation has changed. So this time I kind of looked back into it. So I thought, okay, so somewhat similar to, sourcing product, which wasn't, that difficult. It was somewhat according to my expertise, because a lot of the people who deal with like the rare cannabinoid space have dealings with other wholesale botanicals in those spaces as well. So I reached out, and just from honestly some Google searches, I was able to come up with some people who had some supplies, metragenine at high purity, like 80%, 70%, etc. But from there, I mean, that also did not pan out. So when I was speaking to one of the suppliers, he also mentioned me 7OH and saying that he was more versed in 7-hydroxy. And from there, I became curious of like, what was the utility of it? So I studied the pharmacokinetics behind it a little bit, and it was really interesting because it came to the understanding that there's a lot of versatile utilities for 7OH itself, just due to its high affinity to the mu receptor when it binds, but yet it doesn't affect the middle two receptors. I think I had watched one of your previous podcasts. So there's like four receptors that usually full agonist opiates bind to, like your mu receptor, your delta receptor, your kappa receptor, and your nociceptor. And essentially, your nociceptor is what is dealing with pain, and it's like an anti-nociceptor, just means a painkiller. So from there, I was like, wow, it has 15x mu affinity compared to morphine, yet it's very hard to overdose technically due to, I mean, and this is without, DDIs or mixing with other substances,
Yeah.
because it doesn't affect your central and respiratory system through the beta arrestin pathways. But that becoming clear, I was like, okay, this could also be really great when it comes to people who are dealing with pain management issues, such as cancer patients, people in severe accidents, and things to that nature, just because of the dangerous nature of prescription opiates. And from what I learned, actually, from studying more around the pharmacology, is just what all has to do with being prescribed opiates in general, because there's many factors that I think people are not really understanding, like the lipophilicity that has to do with your BMI. So there's some lipophilic and lipophobic opiates. So if you look at morphine, it's actually lipophobic, and it's a polar metabolite, meaning you can process it through your liver, where heroin, just becoming diamorphine, makes it much more difficult. It becomes an extrahepatic metabolite, so it goes to your actual GI tract. And at the same time, it's also lipophilic, meaning it binds and sticks to your lipids. So I think the withdrawal symptoms intense due to the lipophilicity. If you have a higher BMI, you're going to feel less than you would even if you have a higher tolerance, which is kind of interesting too, because I think a lot of people kind of draw their conclusion to how they're affected by these different substances just based on tolerance, when BMI is actually sometimes even more important than tolerance itself. So I think when people are being dosed by doctors in general, sometimes, unless they're going to like compact pharmacies or things of that nature, a lot of the times they're taking too high of a dose that's relative to their BMI in comparison to their actual tolerance, which is just your CAMP, which is your cyclic adenosine monophosphate. So you're just trying to match tolerance, and it like drops, and you're gonna have to take more once that rises. And it's kind of an interesting process. But when I was looking at all those things, kind of in succession, I thought, I guess it's very important to take this into account when dosing any of these things in general. So what I came to see is that sometimes there's a lot of different effects with metabolizing, pharmaceuticals in general, even kratom, extracts, and alkaloids. Because I mean, I think people overcomplicate the sense of alkaloids in general when it's just like, it's like a nitrogen-based molecular structure. But if you look at like cocaine is like an alkaloid, and I think sometimes the problem with kratom powder or just teas and leaves in general is if you were to try to chew, a multitude of coca leaves in order to get the same effect of cocaine, I'm pretty sure at a certain point you'd be feeling quite sickly, where kind of can apply the same thing to kratom. It's like when you're having like a very pure extract, you can metabolize that much easier than metabolizing all the plant matter that's essentially coming with the leaves and the plant that your body is not necessarily prone to metabolizing, if that makes sense. So
yeah, no, that makes complete sense. I think when it comes to any substance, I think people need to be kind of aware of, dosing specifically, and like kind of be in touch with their body enough to know like what feels right for them and all of that. And for a lot of people, it does take larger amounts of like leaf to achieve the desired effect. But then there's like this kind of authoritarian idea that, we need to stop people from kind of becoming dependent, you know what I mean? And so there's just all of these issues when it comes to autonomy and what you put in your body and stuff like that. But when I look at extracts, let's say specifically, logically it makes a lot of sense to be able to consume something that is just, it's smaller. It's not as much that you have to consume, and it's like that to me it makes sense. But there's a lot of people I think who are really into just leaf that definitely have strong opinions on extracts, and then obviously have really, really strong opinions on like 7-OH. And so there was something that you said that I wanted to kind of touch on briefly, and it's so there's this idea now, and I've heard this from various people. I don't know where this is coming from, but that 7-OH can affect your respiratory system, and that it can cause actually respiratory depression. What is your understanding of that? And is that not accurate? Like what are your thoughts on that?
For respiratory depression, I mean, in comparison to, let's say, a full agonist opiate, it definitely has much less of an effect on your respiratory system. Now, that being said, I think there hasn't been any official studies on 7-OH with human beings with clinical trials. So I couldn't give you a complete, perfect, definitive answer. But from the basic data, it does definitely not have the same effect that you would with a full agonist opiate at milligram to milliliter doses that you would ingest. But that being said, it also has unknown DDIs and different drug interactions that we're all not completely aware of. So I mean, I'm pretty sure that there would be negative reactions with SSRIs, other opiates in general, alcohol, things of that nature, that in conjunction could lead to issues with respiratory depression. Now, that being said, I think a lot of drugs in general, or pharmaceuticals, prescription, not RCs, etc. If you are not aware of what allergens or the interactions of these drugs, and you start mixing a lot of things, it's very dangerous, because you're not going to be completely sure, and even scientifically they're not completely sure how your body is going to react specifically to this, based on a multitude of reasons. Because like the body in general is like a biomechanical electrical machine to a certain extent. So it's like, when you're having your brain, it's like a humongous circuit board. So when you're just pressing and altering all these different buttons and these things that you're feeling, certain small things can offset the whole computer, if that makes sense. So you want to kind of be careful. So what I would suggest is just anything that you're taking or ingesting, whether it's even prescription medicine in general, and when it comes to painkillers or opiates or SSRIs, to like maybe even start with a smaller than recommended dose in order to kind of get a feel for how you're going to interact with these things. Not saying that, like, I mean, when it comes to like antibiotics, I would obviously like advise to, take the full dose. And, I'm not giving any real doctors, advisories or anything, but just saying to that extent, like, you don't want to keep dosing yourself when you're unsure of how you're going to be affected. So it's always good to start at a certain smaller dosage and then move forward based on how you feel. But, even with 7-OH, I would suggest not taking more than 20 to 40 milligrams daily. I think when you start abusing 7-OH, you're going to actually have to deal with withdrawals similar to full agonist opiates, maybe not to the same extent. But, when it's applied to drinks and things like that, I think you can even get a very splendid effect when you're dealing with nothing more than 5 milligrams. But this also is very apparent to people's BMIs because 7-O is lipophilic and metragenine is lipophilic. And I think metragenine is slightly more lipophilic than 7-O. So it sticks in your fat for longer. And I think that's what also leads to other withdrawal symptoms and things of that nature. But it's just having a general sense of what you're doing and and how you're approaching it, and being able to stay kind of in the relevant conscious of like how it's affecting you versus just how good it feels, because I think a lot of people focus just on like the immediate feeling, and they're not really journaling or noting or taking enough caution for what's being affected by the side effects of some of these things.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think that, people just need to be educated on what they're consuming, first of all. And I think that people are often very quick to just consume stuff without really understanding what it is they're consuming, how it's actually affecting them. And like what you said, they're really just looking at like effect, like how do you feel from it, which is obviously relevant, but it's like, I think that that's where issues arise with anything, is just like kind of mindlessly consuming things. And there's ways that you can do this to where you are mindful. And that's why I think like informed consent is important. Even if you're not like, you don't have to be a clinician or a doctor to like advocate for people when it comes to them being informed on what they're consuming. And, honestly, I'm like I'm definitely an advocate for 7-OH because I've seen firsthand what it can do. And I've seen, firsthand what it does for people who are, let's say, like going through like a fentanyl and like xylazine withdrawal.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so like that's where that's what like made me a little bit curious at first, as I was like, all I heard was just people kind of like talking about how sketchy it was, and then I like saw it actually in like a real, like saw it applied, and it worked in that scenario. And it definitely just kind of, I don't know, it changed my views on it. And I think that like when we're dealing with, its potential to cause respiratory depression, or like, that doesn't then invalidate it and make it something that should not be available to people. I think that that people should ideally be able to consume whatever the fuck they want. Like that's just how I see this. And also it's way more accessible than a lot of other things, and people will bring that up as like a negative. I think that's a positive, because I mean I believe in like completely ending prohibition and there being just free access to any substance anyone wants to consume. And so I'm actually on board with the ease of access, because that's like in alignment with my philosophy. I think that the only thing that can be a downside to that is like sometimes the price point for some people.
Well, there's a couple points that I'd like to touch on, not to interrupt you or anything.
No, go ahead, bro.
Just okay, you had mentioned accessibility. When I think about 7-OH and accessibility, obviously what I think is a problem is mostly the price point. Now, when they're charging people $50 for 4 tablets, and they know that it has addictive properties, and most of the people who are consuming a large amount of 7O are usually coming out of a place of addiction. Not all of them, but sorry, but that being said, I think it's very important to take into account, like, okay, you need to offer something. That's why I've started offering the powders as well, like at retail. But I've done like a 30-70 or 70-30 blend, where it's like 30% 7O, 70% metragenine. So people can have like the equivalent of 20 tablets on hand, give them a milligram spoon to dose with. And I'm sure that might kind of infuriate some of the tablet manufacturers, because equivalent 1 kilo is 98,000 tablets. So if you can go retail and you have a consignment deal where you're selling 4 tablets at $50, obviously, you're making $1 million margins, which is good. But I mean, on a business standpoint, but I think to the consumer, you're going to burn them out to a certain point, because you also have to take into account, you can damage your receptors. So if you're just burning through your receptors and taking, heaps of 7O, heaps of anything, you're not going to have the same ability to bind with that different group. So I think that's why people switch in and out between Cito and Oxol and 7O, and they feel a slightly different feeling. There's different hydroxyl groups, like 10 hydroxy, there's 9-oxy dismethylmetride, and they're all in just different places on the structure that binds to receptors slightly differently. But that being said, I think there's just a lot of things that actually apply to how this is ingested that you have to take into account when you're actually ingesting it. You know what I'm saying? Because if you think it's just going to be one specific way, like it's going to affect me like this, it's going to affect you in like a myriad of different ways that all kind of have to be accounted for. Um, so yes, I think there is like some great things about it being readily available, but there also are some drawbacks. To be completely honest, I mean, I have my own extract company as well, but just to have the end user be aware of what they're getting themselves into and why they're doing so. I think a lot of people don't analyze why they're taking a lot of drugs in general, or supplements, or things of that nature. And sometimes that has to be some wherewithal and self-analysis to be able to see, like, do I really need to take this many tablets a day, or do I really need to take this much kratom, or am I really just avoiding something else that's actually bothering me in my current situation? Now, when it comes to people who are going through progressive pain management issues, I think that's something that's very important, because I mean, it is something that's powerful. It has the actual, you compare opiates on a milligram scale with morphine. So I think it's at the same level of mu binding affinity as acetafentanyl. So that's why somebody who's on fentanyl, which is 15% of fentanyl, like at a milligram scale. But that being said, I think you're going to have to be very aware that you're taking something that potent in reality, not just because it's not going to affect you in a life-threatening manner. It doesn't mean that it's not shifting your consciousness, shifting your point of view, and shifting how you feel, and shifting how you're processing reality in general. So obviously, when it comes to prohibition, yes, I agree with you. I think a lot of the reasons why things are illegal are not necessarily an ethical standpoint. I think it's based on, I mean, you could get really deep into this, but how are drugs even being passed over the border in general at that quantity, that magnitude, that quantity? There's, a lot of people are being paid lots of money for different levels of production internationally. There's different, trade tariffs and things of that nature that exist also. So there, the reason why a lot of people would lobby against 7.0, or maybe that message is being pushed out, is because it could, in a sense, especially if you combine it with peptide stacks, I think you could almost eliminate withdrawal symptoms pretty easily. Say if you induce like you use like VGF, which induces lipolysis, and then you had 7.0, so then you're getting, you know, that opiate boost feeling while you're, inducing lipolysis to get the actual stuff out, like the fentanyl out of your lipids. And maybe you could use tapering methods and microdosing instead of using Suboxone to a certain extent. And I think it would obsolete methadone in certain instances as well. But I think a lot of these protocols have to be tailored for the individual, rather than just giving a blanket statement like this is going to affect everybody this way, because in reality it does not.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that, I mean, the truth is there are plenty of things out there already that 100% could replace established evidence-based medicines, you know.
Yeah.
That's the truth. And I mean, I'm someone who, you know, I went into the whole like anti-pharma thing for a while, and then honestly just like realized that rhetoric was a little bit tired, and it just didn't serve me to kind of be, you know, on that soapbox, if you will. What do you like to talk about when it comes to this, other than the stuff obviously that you've already said?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, like a lot of the points I wanted to touch on is just the efficacy of 7.0, of metraging. You know, the blends are interesting because you get a myriad of effects. But I think people have to understand when you come to when it comes to the Kratom plant, there's like 50 known alkaloids, and they have amazing effects. Like they're usually stereoisomers, so you'll have like, and I'm not specifically sure. I have to look it up, but metraging, I think the isomer is speciotolene, or I might have pronounced it slightly wrong. Then there's speciogyne, and there's all these things that might have dissociative effects, serotonergic effects, dopaminergic effects. I think the pronunciation I'm a little unsure of, but I think it's agisoline, which is used actually to treat malaria, and that's also an alkaloid found in kratom as well. But what I've been interested in recently is biosynthesis. Is what I'd really like to do is be able to biosynth a pure version of metragenine and 7.0 in general, or do a similar oxidation process, and then see, because I think sometimes you'll have like residual solvent issues. There's a lot of issues with like logistics when it comes to moving the product all around the world, and then people are always it's kind of like when marijuana became illegal, or cannabis, or whatever you want to say, like in California, and probably like what is like the 2010 earlier or whatever, and then everybody's just fighting for the cheapest price. So I think just being able to like create something that's more accessible marketplace and not taxing people to the point where they're breaking their pockets, because I think that's another issue that's not very well spoken of is most people can't afford to have a 7.0 habit, and the
Yeah.
more that they get into it, it's just draining them essentially of like every dollar they have. So I think being able to give them access to the powder, access to a blend of the powder at an affordable price or an affordable manufacturing standpoint would be really great for the community in general. And then it kind of gives, I'm not sure if this is a perfect way of explaining it, but I think when things come to a sense of scarcity, people start to act out of emotion and think like, oh man, I need to get my money now, I need to pay for this. But if it's right in front of you all the time, I don't think it's, something that becomes as desired, or that it doesn't perpetuate the desire, because, you can be able to purchase it anytime for some not exorbitant amount. So I think with that, with really figuring out how to have the most efficient, cost-effective production and the cleanest production, which I think would veer into the lane of biosynthesis, because you could almost get essentially 99% pure metragenine. And then I think from there, from doing a little bit more research on the recombinant DNA technology, you could probably do the same thing with 7-OH. That being said, I'm kind of moving in that direction and starting a project on that as we speak. And I think basically what else I'd like to say is basically for everybody who's using any supplements, just to take care in order to digest some of the material, and do a little research on what you're taking, and compare them to other things, and kind of start off small. And I think if you have an addictive personality, or if you've been in a sense of like abusing things in the past, it's much better not to just repeat the same habit with a different substance, if that makes sense. Even if it's not as dangerous or it's not as deadly, I think having the wherewithal and practicing habitual things to increase your wherewithal will kind of lead you in a better direction in general, rather than like, okay, I'm an alcoholic now, I want to be like a 7-hydroxy addict, or now I want to be, heroin to 7-OH or something like that, because it's essentially going to give you the same problems at a certain point. Maybe not the same magnitude of danger. And I think we have to think about it like, okay, it's great. It's a great step to go from smoking fentanyl to taking 7-hydroxy tablets and then tapering down, but it's not necessarily the greatest step. Oh man, I'm losing power here. Oh, hold on. Okay. Charge. Oh, hold on. Man, it's not charging. Oh, here we are. Okay, charging. Sorry.
No, you're good.
It's not the greatest step to then, taking 2,000 milligrams of 7-O a day after day after day, because once you break tolerance, you're going to essentially have to have a tolerance break of at least a week for it to exit your system in order to feel any of the effects at all, really. So
yeah, you want things to be effective for you. That's the thing, is like, even if you just, are advocating for that from that perspective of like efficacy of the thing you're consuming, and aren't even acknowledging, a host of things that can go kind of awry if you're just like consuming things in this way that's not mindful in excessive amounts. You know what I mean? And it's just like, that's what I always tell people, is like, if you want shit to work, then there's gonna have to be some level of like mindful consumption.
Exactly.
And you can be someone who goes from, like, let's say, like smoking Fetty to consuming something like 7-OH in a very more moderate or realistic way.
Manner, yeah, exactly.
Like you can do that. And anyone who tells you that because you have a substance use disorder that you're gonna just consume things in this excessive way, it's not true. It can be true. That can be your reality. You can play that part, but you actually have a say in how you consume things, regardless of what.
Yeah, like how would I compare 7-O or fentanyl is like, fentanyl is an IV chemotherapy drip drug, basically to put you into comatosis while you're receiving chemotherapy. So I think to a certain extent, it's like you're seeing people hunched over like this, like walking zombies, because they're almost literally putting themselves in self-induced comas. So obviously, if you're going from that to some mental clarity, that's great. But I think, like you said, just because you did that doesn't mean maybe you're going to repeat the same actions. But you're going to have to be mindful, if you already were going in that direction, what this could lead to at the same point. But I mean, it's not like playing Russian roulette when you're taking something like fentanyl. But at the same time, you really want to be careful of what you're ingesting, how much you're ingesting, and learning how to taper down from things. So I think the cold turkey effect is really not good when it comes to any substance. So it's like, say, if you want to stop taking 7-O, maybe, if you're into metragenine, then lower your doses of metragenine, then maybe just go to leaf for a certain time period, and then kind of, dwindle down from that. And then maybe if you have another problem, or like, you go into pain management or some drastic things happen in your life, just be aware of like how you were able to navigate these processes, rather than, I guess, just keep using and using and using and then abusing the substance. Because I think when you abuse anything, it gives it a bad name. And I think with every substance, these things are very powerful. They can affect your perception of reality, your actual reality, and they can be harmful when taken in large quantities. So it's something to be very aware of, that there is the luxury to take said substance, but there has to be some sort of sense of understanding, which I cannot provide for everyone. I can give them as much information as possible, but I cannot, control people's bodies and tell them what to do. If someone is going to abuse anything, they probably will. And most of the time, the sad truth of that is they're usually going to have to learn the hard way from their experience in order to, lead a better lifestyle in general. But I think that just comes with like the maturity of being able to purchase some of these things, and why they have age restrictions and things to that nature. But is 7-O deadly like heroin? No. I definitely do not think so. Is it something you should take at high doses every day? Also, I do not think so. But I think if you're able to take anything in moderation and understand the purpose of why you were taking said substance, then I think it can be an amazing thing as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, definitely my views on just the kind of hierarchy of substances and the idea of soft and hard, good versus bad, has like that's changed drastically for me in the past few years. I think a huge thing for me, if anyone wants like a recommendation for a good book, check out Drug Use for Grownups by Dr. Carl Hart. It's like definitely.
Oh yeah, he's a great.
Like totally changed my
Cool.
perspective on a lot of things. And I think that, you know, when we're looking at substances, our experience with these things they're very dose dependent, and it's very dependent on how educated you are on what you're consuming, how mindful you're being. And, you know, everyone deserves complete autonomy when it comes to what they put in their body, but that means that you have a huge responsibility. Like, you have to be aware of what that means for you. And so, yeah, I mean, I can just like echo what you're saying about that, because I totally, I mean, yeah, I agree with that. You know, but
that's also interesting. That brings up a very interesting point when you had just said you're speaking about like what you can put into your body, and then I think it's awareness of said substances, because I think, as at least with the American population, and I think it's very different in Europe. Like, I mean, people consume all kinds of different RCs at festivals and things like that, which we've never heard of. Well, I mean, I've heard of most of them, but the majority of people like don't know what DFCK is, or like whatever, you know.
yeah.
It's just, and you're just altering things to analogs. But I think things can sound scary, you know. They give you like these, they're very stigmatized, but it's just has a slightly different utility and what it's used for. But the doses have to be understood. And a lot of people, and a lot of things that are very uncomprehendable is that, or makes it incomprehensible, is that there isn't a lot of research behind a lot of these things that, you know, people are taking. Like, they're not doing clinical trials on every single drug, every single RC, you know, everything that's applicable to this. But I mean, you know, it doesn't mean also like I think this gives like it's kind of a double-edged sword with when it comes to taking any drug at all. Is basically like, yes, it has benefits. Yes, it can do different things. You can have enhanced social interactions, great experiences, blah, 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 blah. But you can also, you know, ultimately kill yourself taking most of these substances at a high dosage ratio or mixing them with anything. So, you know, it doesn't really make sense to stigmatize it, because it's not really, it doesn't act according to the stigma, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
like,
dude, I always say that substances are not sentient, and they have no will, and they have no ability, they have no cognitive abilities. They're not out to get you. They are compounds that if you ingest them, they will have an effect on you. And yeah, like even the topic of RCs, like I used to just be like, oh, if it's an RC, that means it's bad. Or like, if it's like an analog of something, that means it's bad. And it's just like, no, like this is all, honestly, like all this shit it's all bullshit. And it's often perpetuated by like the more like naturalist, holistic community, actually. And there's this idea that like we have plant medicine, and then we have bad drugs, and it's just like, no, like a lot of that is really because of this weird kind of.
Okay, so to build off that tangent, sorry, before I forget, that's incredibly hilarious, because one thing that people are saying is like, oh, this is all natural, but it makes very little sense, because it's like, okay, if we're extracting anything from anything, like most of the time it's worse to take something that's all natural, because of ingesting all of the unnecessary plant matter that's not giving you the desired effect, which will likely sicken you. Like, if you take too much kratom powder day after day after day, there is a large chance that it can lead to pancreatitis, because you just can't process that much plant matter substantially over and over and over to get the desired effect. And I think it just because it's not unnatural just to extract something to get the substance in which you're looking for. But I think that, like you say, they're putting all of these like stigmatized, like good and evil prospects on just chemicals, you know? Which
we're just dealing with chemicals.
Like, chemicals don't have, like you said, they're not sentient beings. They don't have a conscience. They're not out to get you or anything like that. I think it's like, what would you like to feel? Like, what is it you're actually looking to feel, and how would you like to feel like that? This is the best way in which it would offer you that experience, regardless. Like, when you start giving the drugs a conscience, like, it starts making everything literally insane, because that's not how, you know, chemistry works at all. And I think the more that I've understood chemistry, the more it makes perfect sense. Like, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, dude, 100%. I think people also don't understand that the word chemical doesn't mean artificial or like there's this idea that what like THC, for instance, that what is that? People don't know. They just know, oh, it's THC.
Tetrahydrocannabinol.
Yeah, they're not aware that we're dealing like that's a chemical. Chemical doesn't equal bad. Chemical doesn't equal unsafe
Right.
or dangerous. It's like and
Oh, but that being said too, okay, so this is why biosynth is great, because it's like the protocol for biosynth extraction has to be almost completely perfect. Whereas I think what a lot of people are worried about when it's coming to things that are like not completely all natural is the extraction process when it's like ethanol, methanol based and
yeah,
residual solvents and
residual
things of that
solvents.
nature. But that's why I'm very interested in biosynth, because you're getting literally the pure alkaloid, the pure product, the pure extract. You're not getting any of the other bullshit that was cheaply made, that especially when it's coming from certain areas that there's no proclivity to even manage the GMP standards of what's going on. It's funny because a lot of people will be like, oh, I'm taking red leaf, green leaf, white, and a lot of the times that's just a marketing campaign. One might have a higher level of metrageny maybe, or especially toline, special, but usually I'm almost positive that people in Thailand or Indonesia and Southeast Asia are not specifically organizing each leaf vein in order to make a product specifically for the American clientele. So a lot of these thought processes and marketing strategies, because even the farm industry is huge. Like everything, if we give a message that all of these drugs are bad and you should only take prescribed pharmaceuticals, who's profiting off of that? Like
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way at all. So I think anytime that somebody has a hand in the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, they're going to always bash something. You know what I'm saying? That it's something's wrong with something, and they'll give you 1,000 reasons why this is the best way, and they can give you the best product. And that's not what I want to do. I'd rather just give realistically, like, what's the purest product, what's the purest extract you can take, and give you the recommended dose, and actually give you the information to take less. And I think the less is more when it comes to almost all of these things. And I think it is a very beautiful thing that you could essentially have a stepping stool to step down from withdrawals such as fentanyl, heroin. I mean, there pretty much is no more pure heroin to this point, but
Yeah.
etc. But at the same time, do I think it's something that you should be dependent on? No, I don't think you should be dependent on any substance. But yeah, I think the more you stigmatize things, the more that you start moralizing things that essentially are kind of impossible to do so because it has such like a myriad of effects on different people. It kind of gives a ridiculous like perspective to what the actuality of pharmaceuticals is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what I often say is like that's why I push back on the concept of substances being labeled as inherently addictive. I think that it's not. I don't think that's accurate to state that about anything. I think that what people are
No,
referring
yeah.
to is that it will cause physiological dependence if you take it consistently, which is a completely
Right.
separate thing. And I think that if we kind of remove this narrative of like addictive substance, that it can actually help when it comes to actually like researching these things more. At the same time, I don't want certain things to be overregulated because or just even regulated at a level that is like that I would view as overregulation, because then
Right.
that raises barriers when it comes to access and often leads to prohibition. So it's so tricky because it's like I would like people to have access to like good quality products when it comes to what they're putting into their bodies, but I also don't want something to be over regulated and restricted. And so it's a little bit of like a catch 22 when it comes to that. But I guess like in conclusion, when it comes to the whole like addictive substance thing, it's like I kind of go back to what I said earlier. It's like it's all dose dependent, and it's very dependent on like what you're thinking when you're consuming it as well. And I think that
Right.
that's often not talked about, that like within like psychedelic communities, there's, a lot of talk about like being very mindful. Let's say that you're taking psilocybin and you're like swallowing it, that you're thinking like, I'm consuming this and my intention is to look at this thing and I'm going to, try to expand my consciousness in this area. You don't really hear that when we're talking about these other substances that aren't as sensationalized. And I definitely would encourage people to like do the same thing with everything you consume. Let's say
Right.
you're taking a pharmaceutical for a specific reason. Do the same thing with that. Think about like, hey, I'm taking this and here's my intention and here's the purpose behind this. And you can do that with everything. And I just think that like when we're dealing with, again, things that aren't labeled as, that aren't psychedelics specifically, like we don't see that as much,
And you know what I would do to interject, and I think is very important. I think it's very good to build like a good communal structure around yourself when you're taking substances in general, just to have people kind of keep you in check. So, if someone sees you doing something every day, they can kind of, have some resolve by thinking like, hey, do you think maybe you're taking too much 7-0? Or maybe do you think you're taking too much of this? And, because it can be socially enjoyed taking 7-0. Like I've made some seltzers where, they're probably about 5 milligrams up to 10. And it's like kind of like hanging out. Like you could drink them at the Kava Kratom bar, and it's like more euphoric, obviously, than Kratom itself. But you can hang out and kind of have a good time, and it kind of gives you like a bar experience without feeling like drastically hungover or crashing your car or doing anything to that nature. Not saying that you can drive while taking large amounts or any amounts of soda, but maybe small. But at the same time, I think it's important to kind of understand, like, most people who have addictive personalities have had like traumatic life events have pushed them into these places of, addiction, or just because they're unable to deal and process their own emotions. So they use substances to cope with what's going on. So I think building a community of people with like-mindedness who aren't so judgmental can kind of allow you to indulge in things, hang out, have a good time, but also keep you in check at the same time for not taking it overboard, rather than just always trying to self-regulate. Because I think one of the problems is that I don't know if we touched on is self-regulation can be very difficult because, if you're feeling great, like why do you want to feel any worse? Like it doesn't, like, and that's usually what the problem is, So
yeah.
when, like, I don't take 7-0 every day. Like I'll take it occasionally, like sometimes, like if I want to just, I've recently, like, stopped drinking alcohol in general. So it's like if I want to hang out or have like a good time to relax, I might have like a 7-0 yerba mate seltzer or something, and
Yeah.
maybe have one or something. But I won't sit there and take tablet after tablet after tablet. But I think I'll do it in the appropriate environment where I'm like, okay, I'm at a social gathering, hanging out with people, discussing ideas, and it's kind of fun. But I
Yeah.
think it's toxic when you're just alone in your room popping tab after tab after tab. Now, if you're in extreme amounts of pain, I think that's a different story altogether. But that's
Yeah.
why it has to be case by case, and it's good to have some outreach in the community. And maybe even when it comes to therapy and things like that, psychological therapy, with going over some of the issues that are really leading people down these dark roads to begin with. Because I think if you have a pretty good life and you've got everything set up, you're not going to just jump into a semi-suicidal, idealism when it's coming to, abuse of drugs.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, there's a lot of things that, just basic needs that kind of need to be met in order for someone to really feel like they can like consume things in a more, I don't know, moderate way. I think at the
Right.
same time that there is an aspect of when we're dealing with decisions, that we are dealing with decision making, obviously, but then there are like pre-existing things that can be going on that can definitely like make it feel harder to make those
Yeah.
decisions in a more responsible way. But I mean, I agree with you. I think if you have people around you that are, first of all, not judgmental and fucking whack, like you want people
Yeah,
who you can
exactly.
be open with, and they're also not going to be weird and judgy. And that's way
Right.
different than having some sort of community that's solely based in you being abstinent or something like that. Like that's not what I'm advocating for at all. I'm advocating for just having people in your life that you can be completely brutally honest with and who will keep it real with you but not be fucking weird, And so you can find that if it's not something that you have and it's something that you can kind of, nurse and nurture, if you will, in your life. I believe that people should have access to these things, and the missing piece when it comes to that often is just being kind of informed on what you're consuming, but
Exactly. Because I mean,
yeah,
if we
dude.
were in this society where everything's bad, or you start labeling pharmaceuticals as bad, and then we'd be like in a dictatorship where you're not allowed to consume anything ever,
Yeah.
and it'd be worse. People would go crazy
Yep.
just because people do not. I think in general, the more that you try to control a human being, usually is you're going to get the opposite of the favorable reaction that you were seeking in the first place. So if you just keep telling someone not to do something, you see it all the time with like kids who maybe like grew up with like wealthy or whatever, and then their parents are trying to push them to go to this college and then put too much pressure on them or do A, B, C, and D. And
Yeah.
usually sometimes they'll have some sort of like spazzed out reaction before then or at that time because they have complete freedom. So I think it interacts in that way where the more you try to bash something, the more you try to force something, you're usually going to get a universally, I think you're usually going to get a negative reaction. And I think even that comes to consumption. You keep trying to force a feeling that you're not feeling because you've already taken too much, then you're going to have a negative reaction. So it's always very important to really let your body kind of speak to you as well. Do the research because you want to be somewhat aware on long-term effects as well. Like if I'm taking this over and over and over and over every day, what are the actual long-term effects? Like what can happen to me? Maybe it's not, and not everyone and not everything is the same. It could affect some person one way and affect you a different way. So that being said, it's very good to read as much as possible, educate yourself, have a community of people of like-mindedness, and then be able to indulge in what you're capable of indulging in, and then being able to actually come to a consensus of your actual limitations rather than perceived limitation per person, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it makes complete sense. I think it takes a certain level of self-advocacy that can be hard to kind of integrate and learn, but it's totally possible. And, usually people they know what's right for them, you know what I mean? And
Mhm.
it's like you can deny that, but like generally speaking, I think humans are pretty capable of being aware of like what's good for them and maybe what's not sustainable, but
Right.
dude, look, I really appreciate you doing this, bro.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I
I'm
appreciate
gonna
it as well.
say that so in accordance with YouTube's terms of services, we're not gonna promote the sale of any substance or supplement. And everything we discussed on this video is for educational and entertainment purposes. But my friend here does have a business. If you want to just mention the name of the business or the website.
It's Kology Kratom
Yeah.
is the name of our brand. Should be kologykratom.org. We have a lot of different. We have metragenine blends with 7.0. We have 7.0 powders, as along with tablets. Along with what I've been enjoying recently is the 7.0 shots. They're only 2 milliliters, but they have about 5 milligrams of 7.0, and you can kind of mix it with your kratom tea if you do choose to, like maybe if you're at like a kratom kava bar or whatever. And I think we're going to start actually making like a ginger lime seltzer, which is almost like a mocktail of a Moscow Mule with like probably that same ratio. Just so it's like, you get that good social feeling without kind of making it to the point where you're obviously nodding off or something, which I
Yeah.
think too, which is basically kind of like the humiliating thing that can happen with 7.0. If you're taking too much and you see yourself nodding off, then you are kind of headed in the wrong direction. It's time to take a step back. But yeah,
Sure.
and honestly, we're working on a lot of different extracts because there's a lot of amazing things that really these alkaloids have to offer in the plant.
Oh yeah, bro. All right, dude. Much love. I'm gonna end the recording, but we'll
Yeah,
stay on for a second.
for sure.
All right.